Can you talk about how, when you work with clients, how you navigate fair versus equal?
Fair versus equal. That's the biggest conversation with a lot of our family farmer and ranchers, isn't it? Because fair isn't always equal and equal isn't always fair. And it's not all about the math. There's a lot of emotion involved in these type of decisions, because the matriarch of the farm family, they still want the family to get together at Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, anniversaries, and birthdays. And they feel that monetary decision on splitting up assets can create some animosity between family members. So it's trying to get at the root issue on what's mom and dad's number one goal. You know, I always ask the patriarch and matriarch of the farm family, is the number one goal to make sure that family harmony's there and things are as equal as they can be, or is the number one goal to make sure that family farm or ranch can continue for future generations, for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren's legacy, and help your children, whether they're active in the operation or non-active operation, understand why you're making the decisions. And I think that's where communication is probably the number one and largest issue in this process. The communication and having family meetings and communicating between family members and helping them understand, here's what mom and dad's goals and objectives are, and here's why we're starting to make some of these decisions.
So what are some of the biggest struggles you see families deal with when we start talking about fair versus equal? For example, I would say dividing land becomes a really big one. Can you talk a little bit about how we can potentially equalize that opportunity?
Yeah. So mom and dad always think, you know, everybody wants to have some ownership in farmland, and most of the time that's true. But I've also seen it where a lot of times where the next generation can't even drive out or even know where that farm ground is. So it's really trying to figure out, okay, how do we control the future of the farm ground so we're always being able to retain that farm ground for the active farm family and the farm generation. But if that child doesn't have an interest in owning farm ground, they don't have that sentimental attachment, then that's what we take a look at, trying to find, okay, what other assets can we use to equalize or make things fair? Okay, and I always say when we have to really focus in on fair, because fair is how do we compensate that on-farm child for the sweat equity that they've poured in to that family farm or ranch. I always use, you know, I always use the example. Let's say, you know, you have an inactive child. They spend, you know, their 30 or 40 of their careers working for corporate America. Okay, and they're getting stock options. They're getting contributions to their profit sharing plan. They're making contributions to their 401k. Maybe they have some employer paid health insurance. Maybe they have a company vehicle. But every day they go to work, they're building their net worth statement. So they're spending 30, 40 years building their net worth statement for the benefit of their family. Are you asking that inactive farm child to turn around and take their net worth statement and split it equally between their siblings? You're not making that request. You're not asking that. But yet at times we look at our active farm child and we say, here, son or daughter, you spend the next 30, 40 years with us and you put the work in, someday this will be yours, but yet you got to split with your siblings equally. It's not fair. So we need to figure out ways to make sure our family farm or ranches can be fair, compensate that active farm child for that sweat equity, but still make sure all family members understand the why. Why did mom and dad make the decisions, and this is why we believe it's fair.
Can you give me an example of how you would give that on-farm heir some sweat equity and reimburse them for maybe some of that unpaid labor?
Yeah, and the nice thing about a lot of these plans is there's no cookie cutter approach to it. It's what feels right. So if it feels right to mom and dad, then it probably is right. But there's lots of examples. I always tell farm families, so you take a look at that on-farm child. If you gave them 1% of the farm assets for every year of service, and at the end of the day, let's say 30 years have passed. Well, if they get 30% of the farm assets, the remaining 70% is then split equally between all the farm children. Is that fair? Well, maybe that on-farm child then is now inheriting more than 50% of the farm assets. Well, if they can inherit more than 50% of the farm assets, so they're in control of the farm, but yet also they have enough equity if they have to buy somebody out that they can go to their lender and say, hey, here's my asset base. I have a sibling that I need to buy out. And you're putting them in a position to be able to buy them out versus in a position where if they only own 20 or 30%, they're working the rest of their lives just to pay off their siblings and never get the true enjoyment to grow the operation. They're just working every day to buy their siblings out.